Hi, everyone. It's Peter talking a little bit about early Christian art, just a little bit in general, and then focusing in on one particular example to give some specific illustrations of basically how the visual arts began to emerge as the Roman Empire shifted its belief system from, in essence, a kind of, well, it's hard to describe. Roman religion and spirituality is a pretty complicated topic in its own right. But I think right now we'll just describe it as a kind of very diverse, polytheistic, pagan practice with lots of sort of cult deities and obviously emperor worship, complicating things a little bit. There's sort of like official religion, and then there's a kind of more like local, like even right down to your own, say house or, city or something like that. The visual culture of ancient Rome, just to kind of come back to that topic briefly, is again itself exceedingly diverse, especially by the time we come into the Christian era. So by that I mean, say later in the second or early third century, by the time we start seeing a kind of establishment of a Christian culture. It's worth remembering for purposes of sort of historical context that the emergence of Christianity in the most full sense of the term in the Roman empires in the time of Constantine in 313 CE with his famous Edict of Milan that declares religious toleration throughout the empire. Roman art tended to be, to a certain degree, dependent on, in a sense, on the ideas of ancient Greece, but also more than ready to, especially in a kind of functional sense, go off in its own direction. Complicating that kind of track, if you will, or studying that track, is the relative absence of a Greek two-dimensional visual record. So paintings from ancient Greece, or frankly any other type of two-dimensional representation, mosaics would be another example, is very, very rare. We see a little bit more in terms of preservation and availability from ancient Rome. And one of the most interesting kind of stories, if you will, in the study of early Christian art is the continuity and difference between the ancient Roman tradition. For a baseline in terms of ancient Rome, we could think about, for example, the kinds of things that were depicted on the walls of private houses in Pompeii. Of course, complicating that sort of track of research is the fact that Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried in 79 CE, so it's not clear to what extent Christian artists had access to Roman models of the kinds of ones that we see today. So that's a kind of a art historical issue. When we talk about early Christian art in Rome, we sort of see the story complicated in a number of important ways. One of them is precisely that pre-313 status of Christianity as a kind of, is it legal? Is it illegal? At the time that we're talking, we'll just pick up, again, a baseline of, say, roughly 200. We could look, for instance, as a good example in terms of, I'm just trying to think in terms of, well, there's Diocletian, end of the 3rd century. The practice of persecution and the notion that Christianity had to be relatively underground. That is to say, we don't really see Christian churches. We don't see obvious public examples of Christian art prior to, loosely speaking, 300, 400. So that hidden aspect is important. The other aspect that's complicated is the notion of content within the works that we do see, that we have available to us today. The idea of interpreting subjects, possible symbolic allusions within Christian art that's a complex one. It's complex for a number of reasons. One of them has to do with the nature of the texts that might have been available, or other, say, oral, i.e. non-written religious traditions that would have been available to worshipers, patrons, artists, and so forth. Knowing what to make of those remains a central kind of theme in the history of art, especially obviously if we're talking about Western art and European art, well into the time of its gradual disappearance at the heart of the art-making enterprise in the West, say, later in the 19th century. So trying to figure out what's going on in these pieces is a little bit complicated. And there's incentive on the part of Christians to not have that information, that content readily available to outsiders, particularly if you are in a period of time where persecution is, a concern of yours. So when we look at early Christian art, we have to be aware of a kind of blending or blurring of classical traditions, classical themes and subjects, but possibly carrying Christian content, or entirely new themes altogether. And this is, part of, I think, of the interest, the fascination of art history is thinking about these possible meanings, oftentimes multiple possible meanings, the kind of intersection of different historical, cultural, social trends all at once. So if we think about early Christian art in the context of this particular fresco painting, there's a lot going on with this. So let's kind of dig in right away. This is a ceiling painting. It's a fresco painted on plaster. Ceiling painting in what's known as the catacombs. It's a particular chamber within a catacomb, the catacomb of Saints Peter and Marcellinus. Catacombs, just a real quick intro on that. It's very common in the ancient world for cremation, that is to say burning a dead body, to be the case. But as we move into the Christian era, what's known as inhumation, literally to put into the earth, burial in essence, that becomes much more common instead. And so finding places to bury the dead is its own interesting sociological, anthropological, what have you, line of inquiry. But in the case of the visual arts, it's quite fortunate in a sense that we have catacombs to preserve some very interesting examples, again, of late antique, early Christian painting. So a cubiculum is basically a square chamber within this extensive series of underground burial sites, where you might have a number of niches in each of the walls containing the remains of the deceased. And then depending obviously on the resources of the survivors, that chamber might be decorated with various subjects. It's worth pointing out, just as a kind of, disclaimer, that catacombs were not sites of Christian worship or anything like that. It's much more common for Christians, if they weren't able to worship in a church, to worship in houses. So small, relatively intimate gatherings celebrating, Christian rites of one kind or another. That's more typical. People would not go down in the catacombs. It wouldn't be a very pleasant place to be. But the decorations within them were certainly intended to remind both the living and the deceased, the spirit of the deceased, the basic Christian subject matters. So what we're looking at here is a kind of an interesting arrangement of these different pictorial fields. You can see in the center circular frame around what appears to be a shepherd. You can see it's a young man, and this is a very kind of classical motif, a young man with a kind of informal shepherd costume, it's a particularly long robe. That changes back and forth, and that's one of the interesting chapters in Christian art. Let's zoom in just a little bit more. In any case, in a very pleasant kind of exterior landscape, you can see these trees right here, very pastoral, literally the sheep in attendance, sort of supervising the entire activity that's going on in the scene. So this is clearly a very, central role implied, I think, in the shepherd. The good shepherd, of course, is indeed, while not it is a pagan classical theme in sculpture, etc. It's also explicitly described in a kind of analogy that Christ makes to his followers, where he describes himself as the good shepherd, the one that doesn't desert the faithful when the wolf is, threatening, doesn't decide to quit. So the idea that Christ, salvation in Christ, is a guaranteed thing, I think is at the heart of this seemingly, kind of generic description or depiction, I should say, that seems a little bit out of place underground there in the catacombs. Surrounding in these other, it's kind of, mimicking classical domed architecture. Again, think of the tholos, that's a Greek word for these round, typical burial temples. You see these figures with their hands up and outstretched, and these are orant figures, O-R-A-N-T. In essence, depictions of individuals praying for the soul of the deceased. So there's a sense, again, good shepherd as Christ, but not explicitly. And again, these are kind of generic, not necessarily Christian. They're, obviously doing, fulfilling some kind of function. And then more interestingly is this apparently some kind of narrative cycle that is in these lunette, half-moon shapes right here. And again, I think this echoes central planned architecture, the tholos type of thing. And what's happening here, you can see there's a sort of, classical Roman galley, Greek galley with the oars and so forth. That is pretty clear. And you can see that there is somebody, apparently, it's kind of hard to make out, but it's definitely, don't have to work too hard to figure out, somebody being thrown overboard of a ship, and there's this curious looking sea monster thing. And the next scene, we're kind of reading it this way, is harder to make out because a large part of it is missing. That's one of the problems with the catacombs. They're not maintained that closely. But we would have to assume that this was indeed following this depiction right here. We have to go to the Hebrew Bible and the story of Jonah, that Jonah is being thrown overboard in the midst of this storm. And that he's probably sitting around wondering what to do with regard to the, his situation. And here he is being evicted from the sea monster, the whale, however you want to describe it. And then here he is at the kind of resolution of the story. It's a little complicated, but suffice to say, following God's will resulted in his being saved from this, if you will, entombment. And this is an important theme in Christian belief and symbolism, the idea of prefiguration, that Jonah is a kind of imperfect anticipator of the themes and events of Christ's life, in particular, the entombment after his crucifixion and resurrection. So what's happening here is a kind of interesting mingling and mixing of Christian and Jewish subjects, beliefs, narratives, and symbols. So there's really, there's a lot going on in this. I guess that's the key thing to think about, that is not necessarily directly presented to the viewer. It's not immediately clear what's going on, that you, in a sense, have to be in the know about it. And this is, I think, a very typical feature of early Christian art, drawing upon a classical tradition of relatively naturalistic depictions. You can see, for instance, a very nice, a male nude right here, robed figures, good shepherd. But all of this is being turned to a very different purpose.